Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Moose Changer Pat's Reading Corner. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today, we are reading Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 in the Belgariad by David Eddings. And as always, you should support the original work by buying the original book. Part 1, Arendia. Chapter 1. Wakun was no more. 24 centuries had passed since the city of the Wasite Errands had been laid waste, and the dark, endless forests of northern Arendia had reclaimed the ruins. Broken walls had toppled and been swallowed up in the moss and wet brown bracken of the forest floor, and only the shattered stumps of the once proud towers mouldered among the trees and fog to mark the place where Wakun had stood. Sodden snow blanketed the mist-shrouded ruins, and trickles of water ran down the faces of ancient stones like tears. Carrion wandered alone down the tree-choked avenues of the dead city, his stout gray wool cloak drawn tight against the chill, and his thoughts as mournful as the weeping stones around him. Fowler's farm, with its green, sun-drenched fields, was so far behind him that it seemed lost in a kind of receding haze, and he was desperately homesick. No matter how hard he tried to hold on to them, details kept escaping him. The rich smells of Aunt Paul's kitchen were only a faint memory. The ring of Dernick's hammer in the smithy faded like the dying echo of the last note of a bell, and the sharp, clear faces of his playmates wavered in the remembrance of them, until he could no longer be sure that he would even recognize them. His childhood was slipping away, and try though he might, he could not hold on to it. Everything was changing. That was the whole problem. The core of his life, the rock upon which his childhood had been built, had always been Aunt Paul. In the simple world of Fowler's farm, she had been Mistress Paul the cook, but in the world beyond Fowler's Gate, she was Polgara the sorceress, who had watched the passage of 4 millennia with a purpose beyond mortal comprehension. And Mr. Wolf, the old vagabond storyteller, had also changed. Garyon knew now that his old friend was in fact his great-great-grandfather, with an infinite number of additional greats added on for good measure. But that behind that roguish old face, there had always been the steady gaze of Belgarath the sorcerer, who had watched and waited as he had looked upon the folly of men and gods for 7,000 years. Garyon sighed and trudged on through the fog. Their very names were unsettling. Garyon had never wanted to believe in sorcery or magic or witchcraft. Such things were unnatural, and they violated his notion of solid, sensible reality. But too many things had happened to allow him to hold on to his comfortable skepticism any longer. In a single shattering instant, the last vestiges of his doubt had been swept away. As he had watched with stunned disbelief, Aunt Paul had erased the milky stains from the eyes of Marchie, the witch, with a gesture and a single word, restoring the madwoman's sight and removing her power to see into the future with a brutal even-handedness. Garyon shuddered at the memory of Marche's despairing wail. That cry somehow marked the point at which the world had become less solid, less sensible, and infinitely less safe. Uprooted from the only place he had ever known, unsure of the identities of the two people closest to him, and with his whole conception of the difference between the possible and impossible destroyed, Garyon found himself committed to a strange pilgrimage. He had no idea what they were doing in this shattered city swallowed up in trees, and not the faintest idea where they would go when they left. The only certainty that remained to him was the single grim thought to which he now clung. Somewhere in the world was a man who had crept through the pre-dawn darkness to a small house in a forgotten village and had murdered Garyon's parents. If it took him the rest of his life, Garyon was going to find that man, and when he found him, he was going to kill him. There was something strangely comforting in that one solid fact. He carefully climbed over the rubble of a house that had fallen outward into the street, and continued his gloomy exploration of the ruined city. There was really nothing to see. The patient centuries had erased nearly all of what the war had left behind, and slushy snow and thick fog hid even those last remaining traces. Garion sighed again, and began to retrace his steps toward the smoldering stump of the tower where they had all spent the previous night. As he approached, he saw Mr. Wolf and Aunt Paul standing together some distance from the ruined tower, talking quietly. The old man's rust-colored hood was turned up, and Aunt Paul's blue cloak was drawn about her. There was a look of timeless regret on her face as she looked out at the foggy ruins. Her long, dark hair spilled down her back, and the single white lock at her brow seemed paler than the snow at her feet. "There he is now," Mr. Wolf said to her as Garion approached them. She nodded and looked gravely at Garion. "Where have you been?" she asked. "No place," Garion replied. "I was thinking, that's all." "I see you've managed to soak your feet." Garion lifted one of his sodden brown boots and looked down at the muddy slush clinging to it. "The snow's wetter than I thought," he apologized. "Does wearing that thing really make you feel better?" Mr. Wolf asked, pointing at the sword Garion always wore now. "Everybody keeps saying how dangerous Erendia is," Garion explained. "Besides, I need to get used to it." He shifted the creaking new leather sword belt around until the wire-bound hilt was not so obvious. The sword had been an Aristride present from Beric, one of several gifts he had received when the holiday had passed while they were at sea. "It doesn't really suit you, you know," the old man told him somewhat disapprovingly. "Leave him alone, father," Aunt Paul said almost absently. "It's his after all, and he can wear it if he likes." "Shouldn't Hedar be here by now?" Garion asked, wanting to change the subject. "He may have run into deep snow in the mountains of Sandaria," Wolf replied. "He'll be here. Hedar is very dependable. I don't see why we just didn't buy horses in Kamar." "They wouldn't have been as good," Mr. Wolf answered, scratching at his short white beard. "We've got a long way to go, and I don't want to have to worry about a horse foundering under me somewhere along the way. It's a lot better to take a little time now than to lose more time later." Garion reached back and rubbed at his neck, where the chain of the curiously carved silver amulet Wolf and Aunt Paul had given him for Aristride had chafed his skin. "Don't worry at it, dear," Aunt Paul told him. "I wish you'd let me wear it outside my clothes," he complained. "Nobody can see it under my tunic. It has to be next to your skin." "It's not very comfortable. It looks nice enough, I suppose, but sometimes it seems cold, and other times it's hot, and once in a while it seems to be awfully heavy. The chain keeps rubbing at my neck. I guess I'm not used to ornaments." "It's not entirely an ornament, dear," she told him. "You'll get used to it in time." Wolf laughed. "Maybe it will make you feel better to know that it took your aunt 10 years to get used to hers. I was forever telling her to put it back on." "I don't know that we need to go into that just now, Father," Aunt Paul answered coolly. "Do you have one too?" Garion asked the old man, suddenly curious about it. "Of course. Does it mean something that we all wear them?" "It's a family custom, Garion," Aunt Paul told him in a tone that ended the discussion. The fog eddied around them as a chill, damp breeze briefly swirled around the ruins. Garion sighed. "I wish Hedar would get here. I'd like to get away from this place. It's like a graveyard." "It wasn't always this way," Aunt Paul said very quietly. "What was it like?" "It was happy here. The walls were high and the towers soared. We all thought it would last forever." She pointed toward a rank patch of winter-browned brambles creeping over the broken stones. Over there was a flower-filled garden where ladies in pale yellow dresses used to sit while young men sang to them from beyond the garden wall. The voices of the young men were very sweet, and the ladies would sigh and throw bright red roses over the wall to them. And down that avenue was a marble-paved square, where the old men met to talk of forgotten wars and long-gone companions. Beyond that there was a house with a terrace where I used to sit with friends in the evening to watch the stars come out, while a boy brought us chilled fruit, and the nightingales sang as if their hearts were breaking. Her voice drifted off into silence. But then the Asturians came, she went on, and there was a different note then. You'd be surprised at how little time it takes to tear down something that took 1,000 years to build. Don't worry at it, Paul, Wolf told her. These things happen from time to time. There's not a great deal we can do about it. I could have done something, Father, she replied, looking off into the ruins. But you wouldn't let me, remember? Do you have to go over that again, Paul? Wolf asked in a pained voice. You have to learn to accept your losses. The Wassite errands were doomed anyway. At best you would have only been able to stall off the inevitable for a few months. We're not who we are. And what we are in order to get mixed up in things that don't have any meaning. So you said before. She looked at the filmy trees marching away in the fog down the empty streets. I didn't think the trees would come back so fast, she said with a strange little catch in her voice. I thought they might have waited a little longer. It's been almost 25 centuries, Paul. Really, it seems like only last year. Don't brood about it. It'll only make you melancholy. Why don't we go inside? The fog's beginning to make us all a bit moody. Unaccountably, Aunt Paul put her arm around Garion's shoulders as they turned toward the tower. Her fragrance and the sense of her closeness brought a lump to his throat. The distance that had grown between them in the past few months seemed to vanish at her touch. The chamber in the base of the tower had been built of such massive stones that neither the passage of centuries nor the silent probing tendrils of tree roots had been able to dislodge them. Great shallow arches supported the low stone ceiling, making the room seem almost like a cave. At the end of the room, opposite the narrow doorway, a wide crack between two of the rough-hewn blocks provided a natural chimney. Dernick had soberly considered the crack the previous evening when they had arrived, cold and wet, and had quickly constructed a crude but efficient fireplace out of rubble. It will serve, the smith had said. Not very elegant, perhaps, but good enough for a few days. As Wolf, Garion, and Aunt Paul entered the low, cave-like chamber, a good fire crackled in the fireplace, casting looming shadows along the long arches and radiating a welcome warmth. Dernick, in his brown leather tunic, was stacking firewood along the wall. Beric, huge and red-bearded and mail-shirted, was polishing his sword. Silk, in an unbleached linen shirt and black leather vest, lounged idly on one of the packs, toying with a pair of dice. "Any sign of Hedar yet?" Beric asked, looking up. "It's a day or so early," Mr. Wolf replied, going to the fireplace to warm himself. "Why don't you change your boots, Garion?" Aunt Paul suggested, hanging her blue cloak on one of the pegs Dernick had hammered into a crack in the wall. Garion lifted his pack down from another peg and began rummaging through it. "Your stockings, too," she added. "Is the fog lifting at all?" Silk asked Mr. Wolf. "Not a chance." "If I could persuade you all to move out from in front of the fire, I'll see about supper," Aunt Paul told them, suddenly very businesslike. She began setting out a ham, a few loaves of dark peasant bread, a sack of dried peas, and a dozen or so leathery-looking carrots, humming softly to herself as she always did when she was cooking. The next morning after breakfast, Garion pulled on a fleece-lined overvest, belted on his sword, and went back out into the fog-muffled ruins to watch for Hedar. It was a task to which he had appointed himself, and he was grateful that none of his friends had seen fit to tell him that it wasn't really necessary. As he trudged through the slush-covered streets toward the broken west gate of the city, he made a conscious effort to avoid the melancholy brooding that had blackened the previous day. Since there was absolutely nothing he could do about his circumstances, chewing on them would only leave a sour taste in his mouth. He was not exactly cheerful when he reached the low piece of wall by the west gate, but he was not precisely gloomy either. The wall offered some protection, but the damp chill still crept through his clothes, and his feet were already cold. He shivered and settled down to wait. There was no point in trying to see anything in the fog, so he concentrated on listening. His ears began to sort out the sounds of the forest beyond the wall, the drip of water from the trees, the occasional sodded thump of snow sliding from the limbs, and the tapping of a woodpecker working on a dead stag several hundred yards away. "That's my cow," a voice said suddenly from somewhere off in the fog. Garion froze and stood silently listening. "Keep her in your own pasture, then," another voice replied shortly. "Is that you, Lammer?" the first voice asked. "Right, you're Detton, aren't you? I didn't recognize you. How long has it been?" 4 or 5 years, I suppose," Lammer judged. "How are things going in your village?" Detton asked. "We're hungry. The taxes took all our food." "Ours too. We've been eating boiled tree roots. We haven't tried that yet. We're eating our shoes." "How's your wife?" Detton asked politely. "She died last year." Lammer answered in a flat, unemotional voice. "My lord took our son for a soldier, and he was killed in a battle somewhere. They poured boiling pitch on him. After that, my wife stopped eating. It didn't take her long to die." "I'm sorry," Detton sympathized. "She was very beautiful." "They're both better off," Lamar declared. "They aren't cold or hungry anymore. Which kind of tree roots have you been eating?" "Birch is the best," Detton told him. "Spruce has too much pitch, and the oak's too tough. You boil some grass with the roots to give them a bit of flavor." "I'll have to try it." "I've got to get back," Detton said. "My lord's got me clearing trees, and he'll have me flogged if I stay away too long. Maybe I'll see you again sometime, if we both live. Goodbye, Detton. Goodbye, Lamar." The two voices drifted away. Garion stood quite still for a long time after they were gone, his mind numb with shock and with tears of sympathy standing in his eyes. The worst part of it was the matter-of-fact way in which the two had accepted it all. A terrible anger began to burn in his throat. He wanted suddenly to hit somebody. Then there was another sound off in the fog. Somewhere in the forest nearby someone was singing. The voice was a light, clear tenor, and Garion could hear it quite plainly as it drew closer. The song was filled with ancient wrongs, and the refrain was a call to battle. Irrationally, Garion's anger focused on the unknown singer. His vapid bawling about abstract injustices seemed somehow obscene in the face of the quiet despair of Lammer and Detton. Without thinking, Garion drew his sword and crouched slightly behind the shattered wall. The song came yet nearer, and Garion could hear the step of a horse's hooves in the wet snow. Carefully he poked his head out from behind the wall as the singer appeared out of the fog, no more than 20 paces away. He was a young man dressed in yellow hose and a bright red jerkin. His fur-lined cloak was tossed back, and he had a long curved bow slung over one shoulder, and a well-sheathed sword at his opposite hip. His reddish-gold hair fell smoothly down his back from beneath a pointed cap with a feather rising from it. Although his song was grim, and he sang it in a voice throbbing with passion, there was about his youthful face a kind of friendly openness that no amount of scowling could erase. Garion glared at this empty-headed young nobleman, quite certain that the singing fool had never made a meal of tree roots or mourned the passing of a wife who had starved herself to death out of grief. The stranger turned his horse, and, still singing, rode directly toward the broken arch of the gateway, beside which Garion lurked in ambush. Garion was not normally a belligerent boy, and under other circumstances he might have approached the situation differently. The gaudy young stranger, however, had presented himself at precisely the wrong time. Garion's quickly devised plan had the advantage of simplicity. Since there was nothing to complicate it, it worked admirably, up to a point. No sooner had the lyric young man passed through the gate than Garion stepped from his hiding place, grasped the back of the rider's cloak, and yanked him bodily off the saddle. With a startled outcry and a wet splat, the stranger landed unceremoniously on his back in the slush at Garion's feet. The second part of Garion's plan, however, fell completely apart. Even as he moved in to take the fallen rider prisoner at sword point, the young man rolled, came to his feet, and drew his own sword, seemingly all in one motion. His eyes were snapping with anger, and his sword weaved threateningly. Garion was not a fencer, but his reflexes were good, and the chores he had performed at Falder's farm had hardened his muscles. Despite the anger which had moved him to attack in the first place, he had no real desire to hurt this young man. His opponent seemed to be holding his sword lightly, almost negligently, and Garion thought a smart blow on the blade might very well knock it out of his hand. He swung quickly, but the blade flicked out of the path of his heavy swipe and clashed with a steely ring down on his own sword. Garion jumped back and made another clumsy swing. The swords rang again. Then the air was filled with clash and scrape and bell-like rattle as the two of them banged and parried and feinted with their blades. It took Garion only a moment to realize that his opponent was much better at this than he was, but that the young man had ignored several opportunities to strike at him. In spite of himself, he began to grin in the excitement of their noisy contest. The stranger's answering grin was open, even friendly. "All right, that's enough of that." It was Mr. Wolf. The old man was striding toward them with Barrack and Silk close on his heels. "Just exactly what do you think you're doing?" Garion's opponent, after one startled glance, lowered his sword. "Belgarath," he began. "Leldarin," Wolf's tone was scathing. "Have you lost what little sense you had to begin with?" Several things clicked into place in Garion's mind simultaneously as Wolf turned on him coldly. "Well, Garion, would you like to explain this?" Garion instantly decided to try guile. "Grandfather," he said, stressing the word and giving the younger stranger a quick warning look, "you didn't think we were really fighting, did you? Leldarin here was just showing me how you block somebody's sword when he attacks, that's all." "Really?" Wolf replied skeptically. "Of course," Garion said, all innocence now. "What possible reason could there be for us to be trying to hurt each other?" Leldarin opened his mouth to speak, but Garion deliberately stepped on his foot. "Leldarin's really very good," he rushed on, putting his hand in a friendly fashion on the young man's shoulder. "He taught me a lot in just a few minutes." "Let it stand." Silk's fingers flickered at him in the minute gestures of the Draznian secret language. "Always keep a lie simple." "The lad is an apt pupil, Belgarath," Leldarin said lamely, finally understanding. "He's agile, if nothing else," Mr. Wolf replied dryly. "What's the idea behind all the frippery?" He indicated Leldarin's gaudy clothes. "You look like a maypole." "The Membrates have started detaining honest historians for questioning," the young errand explained, "and I had to pass several of their strongholds. I thought that if I dressed like one of their toadies, I wouldn't be bothered." "Maybe you've got better sense than I thought," Wolf conceded grudgingly. He turned to Silk and Barrack. "This is Leldarin, son of the Baron of Wildhantor. He'll be joining us." "I wanted to talk to you about that, Belgarath," Leldarin put in quickly. "My father commanded me to come here, and I can't disobey him, but I'm pledged in a matter of extreme urgency." "Every young nobleman in Asturia pledged in at least 2 or 3 matters of urgency," Wolf replied. "I'm sorry, Leldarin, but the matter we're involved in is much too important to be postponed while you go out to ambush a couple of Membrate tax collectors." Aunt Paul approached them out of the fog then, with Dernick striding protectively at her side. What are they doing with their swords, father? She demanded, her eyes flashing. Playing, Mr. Wolf replied shortly. Or so they say. This is Lelderin. I think I've mentioned him to you. Aunt Paul looked Lelderin up and down with one raised eyebrow. A very colorful young man. The clothes are a disguise, Wolf explained. He's not as frivolous as all that. Not quite, anyway. He's the best bowman in Asturia, and we might need his skill before we're done with all this. I see, she said, somewhat unconvinced. There's another reason, of course, Wolf continued, but I think we don't need to get into that just now, do we? Are you still worried about that passage, father? She asked with exasperation. The Marine Codex is very obscure, and none of the other versions say anything at all about the people it mentions. It could be pure allegory, you know. I've seen a few too many allegories turn out to be plain fact to start gambling at this point. Why don't we all go back to the tower, he suggested. It's a bit cold and wet out here for lengthy debates on textual variations. Garion glanced at Silk, baffled by this exchange. But the little man returned his look with blank incomprehension. Will you help me catch my horse, Garion? Lelderin asked politely, sheathing his sword. Of course, Garion replied, also putting away his weapon. I think he went that way. Lelderin picked up his bow, and the two of them followed the horse's tracks off into the ruins. I'm sorry I pulled you off your horse, Garion apologized when they were out of sight of the others. No matter, Lelderin laughed easily. I should have been paying more attention. He looked quizzically at Garion. Why did you lie to Belgarath? It wasn't exactly a lie, Garion replied. We weren't really trying to hurt each other, and sometimes it takes hours to explain something like that. Lelderin laughed again, an infectious sort of laugh. In spite of himself, Garion could not help joining in. Both laughing, they continued together down an overgrown street between the low mounds of slush-covered rubble.